Bouazizi produces, above all, Art Zone. Gravediggers.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, folks, we're back, and happy Tuesday to our listeners. And it's Amr in Toronto.
And it's Erin in Seoul.
And I've been very excited to start this little project of ours. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, we've been talking about this among ourselves for a while. Welcome to our series on the Arab Spring. So 10 years on, we thought we'd examine the causes, events, and consequences of the protests that shook North Africa and the Middle East in 2010 and 2011. If you are really listening closely, you'll notice this week is exactly 10 years from the beginning of these events, like sort of the official beginning.
Yes, it's a decade, and I find decades to be a very nice way, 10 years on, to look back and reflect on everything that's happened since.
Speaking of reflection, our very own Amr is Bahraini and has a great deal of insight to offer that you really can't find anywhere else. So if you're interested in the Arab Spring, you have come to the right place.
Aw, thank you. Yeah, this episode is not about Bahrain, but we're going to get into a very specific Bahrain-based episode soon. So keep an eye out. That's going to come.
We're actually going to try our best to do one country per episode, but we might have to stretch them out to two-parters to really give the series that attention it deserves. We're also going to try to maintain our podcast episodic format, meaning you don't have to listen to the entire series to understand it, but still, given how connected some of these events are, it might benefit listeners to start here with Tunisia and then follow us from there.
Yeah, there will be a lot of recurring themes between the episodes, especially it's called the Arab Spring. There was a lot of shared cultural and social and political factors, both before the revolution, during the revolution, and what happened afterwards.
Of course, we're going to give each country individual attention, but we will end up repeating ourselves many times because many of these factors, especially that went into it, are very similar.
Yes.
On December 17th, 2010, at approximately 11:30 a.m., a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi approached the government's office in his town, Sidi Bouzid. Standing in the middle of traffic, he shouted, "How do you expect me to make a living?" before dousing himself in gasoline and lighting a match. Bouazizi never recovered from a coma and died in a Tunisian hospital several weeks later. But his self-immolation would literally ignite protests across Tunisia against state corruption and a lack of opportunities for young people. These demonstrations then spread across the region, most famously to Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, in a series of uprisings now collectively known as the Arab Spring.
Considering how these uprisings have ended up, I would consider calling them more the Arab autumn before what ended up becoming the harsh winter more than anything.
I had a professor at university who insisted on calling them the African uprisings because they started in North Africa. So even the name actually is a debate. You've got Arab uprisings, African awakening, Arab revolt.
Names are very important, I think. They reflect a person's political and social perspective a lot more than anything else as well. And I tend to call them the Arab uprisings. I'm a big fan of the Arab Spring, so I just call them the Arab revolt or the Arab uprisings. But yeah, we'll get into how they're all similar, but each country has its own unique factors as well.
As a podcast, we also have to consider the name that most people use when searching for information about these events and use that.
Yes, that's true. The media and, the general public sort of see this as the Arab Spring.
But while Bouazizi's suicide may have been the immediate catalyst of the protests in Tunisia, we have to understand why he felt driven to such extreme measures if we are to discern the causes of the Arab Spring. In addition to exploring these reasons and the timeline of the protests themselves, we want to delve into the consequences of the demonstrations and the state of the region 10 years later. So let's begin with the causes. What causes a revolution and why some localities see uprisings while others with similar conditions do not are topics of endless scholarly debate. In the words of Leon Trotsky, I know, revolution is impossible until it is inevitable.
In the word of Trotskyists, could you please pay $1 for this newspaper?
Hopefully, by the end of this series, we will have a better picture of the so-called Arab Spring and its magnitude as a series of events in North Africa and the Middle East. Today, of course, we'll focus on Tunisia. Tunisia may have seemed like an unlikely candidate for an uprising, given its reputation as a stable country in North Africa. Among Western governments, at least, Tunisia was a post-colonial pet. The state was friendly toward Western economic interests and represented a beacon of so-called liberal reform in the region. But it was precisely this neoliberalism that led to the economic despair documented in Stephen J. King's, not the horror author, Liberalization Against Democracy, The Local Politics of Economic Reform in Tunisia, in 2003. Structural adjustment programs instituted by the World Bank and IMF benefited the capitalist class at the expense of the poorest Tunisians. Those without the means to accumulate land were essentially forced back to serfdom.
I think it's important to understand here that in these countries, a large part of the economy falls within what we can call the informal sector. So exchanges of goods and services that exist outside of the official state or sort of private companies as such. And, such jobs are very highly precarious, and they're symptomatic of a country where the state and the state apparatus exist solely to enrich a very small number of elites while leaving the majority to wallow in poverty. I believe Ashkar in the book The People Want notes that for the countries that ended up experiencing what we call the Arab Spring, the informal sector accounts from about 40 to 80% of the economy.
Definitely. Such conditions lead to severe endemic poverty, inequality, and precarity, in the words of the Marxist Lebanese scholar Gilbert Ashkar. All of this, according to Ashkar, was the driving force behind the uprisings in the region, but not necessarily the only contributing factor. Journalists, scholars, and historians note that repressive policing tactics, political corruption, and a lack of state transparency also contributed to Tunisia's protests. In the 54 years of Tunisian independence before the uprisings, the country only had two presidents, Habib Bourguiba and Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Bourguiba credited himself with negotiating Tunisian independence with France and founding the modern state. And Bourguiba was kind of a real asshole about this. He clearly looked down on countries like Algeria, which had to wage decades-long war in order to win their independence in battle.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of him. He seems like a bit of a prick.
No, I'm not a big fan of him either, Amr.
Yeah.
Damn, Das Criminal podcast isolating those Bourguiba stans.
Yeah, Bourguiba is not a friend of our show.
Bourguiba earned the support of the United States and France, the former colonial leader. His regime really repressed Tunisia's largest workers' union, the General Union of Tunisian Workers, or UGTT, following the French acronym.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of news reduce the Arab Spring to Twitter and social media. And I think this is incredibly unfair as it ignores the crucial role the labor movement played in mobilizing people onto the streets. I mean, Twitter was a tool to disseminate information, but I think it's important to understand that people in Tunisia and the region were already politically switched on, so to speak, and people were mostly politically conscious in a way that I struggle to see here in North America. Insofar as there's a history of mass mobilizations and there's also a history of organized labor, even despite the repression that would facilitate for, mass demonstrations to not only erupt, but then be organized along labor lines.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into the social media debate, I would say, in our discussion on Egypt. But at least in my opinion, social media is just that, another form of media.
Yes.
In the early 1980s, Tunisia adopted structural reforms recommended by the IMF and World Bank that cut subsidies for products like essential foods. Tunisians protested this, demonstrating resistance to the regime and its draconian repression even back then, and the government restored some of the subsidies. A group of people living paycheck to paycheck, wondering how they'll get their next meal, doesn't have much to lose in terms of protesting the capitalist conditions that brought them there. United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a friendly reminder that the two most famous successful revolutions, arguably, the French Revolution of 1789 and the Russian Revolution of 1917, both began as bread riots, where the people, by the way, largely led by women, marched demanding bread, given scarcity of bread and high bread prices. And I actually think that the capitalist class learned from this. If you look around and you see in the so-called First World or, North America and Western Europe, there is just enough comfort among workers, just enough to be scared of radical change lest their precarious position collapses in and of itself. And of course, that comfort is fast crumbling away. But I think, and I posit that a large part of the real, worst of the capitalist conditions have been exported to the developing world to facilitate such comfort here.
Oh, no, I definitely agree. We talked about this on our episode about the factory collapse in Bangladesh, for sure.
Yeah.
In 1987, Zina El Abidine Ben Ali comes to power in a bloodless, so-called medical coup, claiming Bourguiba is too old and mentally unstable to lead. Kamala, are you listening? Ben Ali distanced himself from Bourguiba's Dastur or Constitution Party and renamed his party the Constitutional Democratic Rally, or RCD, again using the French acronym. He consolidated power within the RCD and even amended the constitution in 2002 to allow himself to serve longer than the allotted 3 terms. Of course, nobody in the higher ranks of the Democratic Beacon USA batted an eye since Ben Ali was receptive to Western interests and maintained capitalism in Tunisia. Ben Ali infamously quashed all opposition and didn't even allow the semblance of a venting mechanism, a way for people to complain about the regime without affecting any real change. By this time, unemployment and underemployment were rampant in particular regions of the country, especially the interior. Underemployment, for any listeners that don't know, is when you are educated to a certain degree, but you work in a job that doesn't really utilize that education. Young men, in particular, couldn't find jobs to support their families. The Islamic tendency, later renamed Ennahda movement, meaning rebirth, became more active during this time, though the regime severely repressed it. We will see the same thing in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, and much like the Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamists in Tunisia stepped into the vacuum left by the state and provided people with vital social services the state had abandoned. When a political party offers you and your family childcare and healthcare and subsidized housing and secures you a job and so on and so forth, and the state, basically ignores you or otherwise abuses you, it's not really hard to see why lots of people, both, Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere, support the Islamists.
In addition, Ben Ali used the Algerian Civil War from 1991 to 2002 and violence by the Algerian Islamic Salvation Front to crack down on Ennahda in Tunisia. 9/11 also gave Ben Ali more cover for shutting down Islamist parties and rounding up their alleged supporters. The Ben Ali regime was incredibly corrupt, and such corruption was an open secret in Tunisian society. Ben Ali attempted to consolidate economic resources at the expense of ordinary Tunisians through the National Solidarity Fund, also known as 2626 from its alleged account number. Donations were not optional in practice, and the poorest Tunisians suffered. Ben Ali funneled this money to himself and clients of the RCD. Additionally, Ben Ali's wife and in-laws even privatized aquifers in Tunisia's interior, with support from transnational corporations, of course. The Hayat company bottled water that interior farmers needed to grow crops. Hayat in Arabic ironically means life. One of the places majorly affected by this was Sidi Bouzid, where Mohamed Bouazizi lived. Ben Ali and his family lived in excess, while ordinary people struggled to get by. Even American politicians wined and dined by them, noted how much the lower classes must have hated the ruling family's extravagance.
Yeah, as Selena Kyle / Catwoman says in the great avant-garde movie The Dark Knight Rises, quote, "How can you live so large while leaving so little for the rest of us?" End quote.
Tunisia also instituted a form of state feminism that prioritized the appearance of freedom over true liberation. In terms of women's rights, Tunisia has basically followed in the footsteps of France. Abortion is legal, polygamy is banned, and the headscarf is a constant topic of debate. Still, to differing degrees, women in both these countries are subjects under capitalism and face exploitation as workers, and violence from men, including from police and the state.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that while Tunisia, and by the way, Egypt and other countries for that matter, draft laws that were meant to help women in theory, those laws were largely enacted as a sort of quid pro quo to unlock US aid money that is conditional on these laws being passed as markers of progress. And, in practice, those laws are rarely applied because it's hardly progress when the very organs that are meant to enforce these laws, the judges, the police, the people in positions of authority, are mostly men who don't particularly believe in said laws or don't care either ways.
Oh yeah, the United States does not care about world feminism. That's such a fucking joke.
Oh yeah.
The relationship between feminism and the Arab uprisings is among the most contested matter of the revolts. Were some of the protests a response to a version of increased women's and minority rights under authoritarian governments? And does this make them reactionary?
It's fascinating how women's rights can be weaponized to dismiss or otherwise empower particular regimes. I think one of the interesting things is how, at least from the news I read, there's a lot of uproar, for example, about Iran not allowing women into stadia to watch football matches. Pre-COVID, I mean, the before times. And I found it fascinating how so much focus was spent on that and on women protesting the stadium ban in Iran. And, rightfully so, the ban is barbaric. But the same ban exists in Saudi Arabia. And, there's hardly any coverage of that. It's just solely focused on Iran. And, you could tell it's largely because, Iran is the official enemy, TM, whereas Saudi Arabia is seen as an ally, and therefore the media is much more hesitant to really delve into its completely archaic systems.
Right, and the Gulf, I hesitate to use the word slavery, but has heavily exploited labor, especially from foreign workers, and the way they treat women from places like South Asia, East Africa is just absolutely abysmal. In my mind, it is impossible to criticize the treatment of women in the Middle East without putting that in the center of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Facing repression by the regime, many Tunisian activists moved their work online. The government attempted to censor online criticisms, but the internet is a big place, and squelching dissent is like playing whack-a-mole. Still, the regime did manage to track down and arrest some online critics, demonstrating its total smothering of opposition. Mohamed Bouazizi's situation was emblematic of the problems in Tunisia. Sidi Bouzid is an interior city suffering from poverty and privatization of resources. Bouazizi was a young man without formal stable employment, and he operated a produce cart, vegetables or maybe apples, to make ends meet for a family of 8. Some initial reports say that Bouazizi was an underemployed college graduate, but this isn't true. He never graduated from high school. So now we get into the actual events of what began what many people now know as the Arab Uprisings or the Arab Spring. On December 17th, 2010, a female city employee confiscates Mohamed Bouazizi's fruit cart and produce for operating without a license. Apparently, some sort of scuffle ensued. Some reports say that the employee insulted Bouazizi or possibly slapped him, but she disputes this. She called the police, who then beat Bouazizi. Bouazizi's family say the employee's gender contributed to Bouazizi's humiliation. Later that same day, Bouazizi goes to the municipal office to complain about his treatment and try to retrieve his fruit cart. Nobody there would listen to him.
Yeah, I totally see this. I mean, when I was getting my driver's license in Kuwait, it was an exercise in humility. You go to these offices, and this failed son is there drinking tea, and he'll tell you to go to another office, and that person tells you to go to another office, and it's just, government bureaucracy in the Middle East is a nightmare at the best of times, and the jobs are all given based on nepotism and connections. So most office clerks and staff are just there to drink tea and chat with their friends. And, if you want to obtain something from them, it just ends up in you going from office to office playing whack-a-mole, unless you know somebody inside who could help you. And I completely see this. And also, I believe that I read somewhere in Bouazizi's case that the woman confiscated his fruit cart allegedly for operating without a license, but the claims were that he wasn't paying people the right bribes or something, or like the bribes increased and he wasn't able to afford the new bribes or something of that nature.
Well, also, with systems this slow and inadequate, I could see where it's nearly impossible to get a license anyway.
Exactly, yeah. In these sort of systems, government employees are not exactly well paid either. So a large part of the economy also relies around bribe, as we call them back home, bakshish, or like quote unquote tips. So like I imagine that a number of these owners of these stalls are accustomed to paying some bribe, and sometimes if the bribe goes up, they can't afford it, and your stall gets confiscated in retaliation, and it was just a straw too much for him.
I used to live in Jordan. I went to the University of Jordan, as some of our listeners might know, for a while. And I cannot explain how pervasive some of this is. So, for example, in the building where I had most of my classes, there was no one to clean or take care of the bathrooms. So, in the women's bathrooms, the toilets themselves had long been destroyed. Nobody fixed them. So they just took them out, and you would just like pee in a hole in the ground, like directly into the plumbing system. And then you had to bring your own toilet paper, because that's like not a thing, and use it, take it with you, and find somewhere to throw it out. No joke.
Charming.
Right, but this is like people just do not dedicate resource. There are no resources for that.
Yeah, the absolute. I mean, there is, but like it's all in Swiss bank accounts for particular, like royal family members or particular party members, depending on which country you're in.
Yeah, every building had a portrait of the King Abdullah and the Crown Prince Hussein in it. They had the resources for that, but not for an actual toilet in the women's bathroom.
Yeah, it's fucking grim. It's awful. I have so many stories from back home of these sort of scenarios. It's just despicable.
Without alerting his family, Bouazizi buys a can of gasoline, returns to the site of the office, douses himself in the flammable liquid, and lights a match, sending his own body up in flames. Bouazizi did not die that day, but he never woke up from a coma and died in January of 2011.
There's something particularly universal about self-immolation as a form of protest, isn't there? I don't know if Bouazizi did this because he recognized its history as a form of protest, or if he just came up with it himself, but I can't help but make the connection between him and the Buddhist monks who were setting themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War.
Well, I would say to do it that same day, just a couple hours later. This is only like 2 hours after his fruit cart was confiscated and he couldn't get anyone to listen to him to get it back. Obviously, this was somewhat impulsive, I would say, unless he was saying to himself, next time they take my cart away and no one listens to me, I'm going to set myself on fire. But he didn't alert his family. He didn't write a note or something like that. He did scream, "How do you expect me to make a living?" and then put himself up in flames.
Yeah, I guess we'll never know if it was impulsive or organized. But I find it fascinating how, in a lot of cases, and this goes, by the way, this is historical. Like, I think I read in a book somewhere that in ancient Rome, it was seen as like a way to curse your enemies to commit suicide on their doorstep. So like if you commit suicide on someone's doorstep, you're basically cursing them, requesting that the gods curse them eternally for a wrong they may have done on you or something of that nature.
Well, it's a very public and obvious display of despair in his case.
Yeah.
On December 18th, 2010, riots erupt in Sidi Bouzid. Police respond to peaceful demonstrators with tear gas, prompting them to become even angrier at the state of corruption and violence in Tunisia. Demonstrations spread, and police tactics became even more violent, including shooting at protesters. On December 22nd, 2010, two men, Hassin Naji and Ramzi El Aboudi, killed themselves in separate incidents. Both were responding to hunger and joblessness and financial difficulties, in El Aboudi's case resulting from microfinance debt.
Yeah, I can go on for days about microloans. They're pretty much a cancer spreading throughout the developing world. There have been reports of just rampant plague of suicides from Tunisia to India by workers and peasants who can't pay back their microloans.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of times with microloans, the microloan corporation, which usually disguises itself as a charity, but it's a corporation, make sure that the community is aware who receives those microloans to put this extra pressure on them to pay them back. So if they don't pay them back, they face so much shame. Like, it's just really an abysmal thing.
Yeah, it's gross on so many levels. I've read how farmers in India have taken to drinking bleach as a form of suicide because they can't pay their microloans. Either drinking bleach or drinking fertilizer. It's really grim.
Oh, Jesus. And also, a lot of people end up using those loans to pay for things like medical bills or education for their children, and then reach out to the community anyway to try and pay them back. You would be doing a lot better just to give poor people cash.
Yeah, it's awful. And, the microloans are designed that they shouldn't be paid. Like, they're designed to bankrupt people. They're not just like normal loans. They're designed specifically with incredibly absurd interest rates to trap people into debt forever, essentially.
Right. And it's also a fucking joke because these so-called charities are like, oh, we're not going to give people money. We're going to help them make their own money through a small business. And it's like acting like they're creating systemic change, but actually they're ignoring the system. Like, they are ignoring how capitalism itself is disempowering.
Well, they're perpetuating the system. They use debt
Right.
to keep people in positions of dismal precarity.
Right. Microfinance loans are predatory.
Yes, and haram.
On December 27th, 2010, protests have spread to the coast, including Tunis, and major labor unions have become involved. On December 28th, Ben Ali visits Bouazizi in the hospital, but the public sees through this stunt and doesn't allow Ben Ali to rehabilitate his image through empty gestures. The same day, Ben Ali gives a press conference calling the protesters, quote, extremist mercenaries, end quote, and vows to squash them. The public basically ignores him. On December 29th, Ben Ali shuffles around some members of his cabinet, hoping to quell the opposition with new appointees. Again, it doesn't work.
Yeah, you keep in mind that the cabinet is beholden to Ben Ali. It's not like a democracy where you vote for members of parliament who then pick a prime minister, or you vote for the prime minister yourself. It's just Ben Ali is there and he picks the ministers as he sees fit. There's no particular elected mandate at all.
In Jordan, where you're not allowed to criticize the king, technically, you are allowed to criticize his cabinet, so people obviously use that as a proxy for criticizing the administration. But ultimately, that acts like a venting system, as we mentioned before. Like, sure, you can write in the newspaper that you don't like a policy, but it doesn't matter. But sometimes it helps to just allow people to complain.
Yeah, but it also reminds me of like how sterile that complaint can be. And it reminds me of things like the 1905 Russian Revolution, where the failed one, where a lot of like the contemporary liberals of the time would limit their criticism to the cabinet of the Tsar. The common saying was that the Tsar is a good man and he wants everyone to be better off, but he's surrounded by corrupt, bad men. And it's the same, here, I guess, with Jordan or with other places where like there is some subset of people who will say that the king is a good man. It's just the cabinet are corrupt.
Yeah, but it's worth pointing out, too, that 12 years after the failed 1905 revolution came the big one.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, hopefully, knock on wood, 12 years from 2011, hopefully we'll see a big one too.
It's the same as like, doesn't every breakup bring you closer to your true love?
Doesn't every failed revolution bring you closer to shooting the Tsar?
God bless the broken road that led me straight to you. So in Tunisia, protests grow and police continue to violently repress them. By this point, the movement has grown too large to disperse even with tear gas and bullets. For each protester injured, several more take his or her place. For example, thousands of Tunisia's lawyers joined a strike after police had been violent toward a peaceful protest of several hundred lawyers.
Yeah, I think strikes were a crucial part of the uprisings, and it's important not to get too lost in the spectacle of demonstrations and to appreciate that a significant aspect of the uprisings were labor actions and mass strikes that pretty much ground countries' economies to last standstill. And, while the national bourgeoisie may not give a damn about the people, their wealth is still predicated upon the exploitation of said people. And strikes end up stopping the flow of wealth going upwards. So it does affect very radical and immediate change in that sense.
Certainly. In addition, several internet bloggers and activists were arrested, including rapper El General and Tunisian Workers' Communist Party leader Hama Hamami. Most were released shortly after due to protests. It becomes increasingly clear to the military that they were outnumbered by the protesters, and Ben Ali feared they would not fire on them if called upon. On January 14, 2011, Ben Ali dissolves his government and declares a state of emergency. He and his family board his private aircraft and, with Libyan protection, attempt to flee to France, but France wouldn't allow him to land, which, they will always fuck you over.
With friends like these, who needs enemies, eh?
Ben Ali and his family land in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where Ben Ali would spend the rest of his days in Saudi Arabia and die of prostate cancer in 2019 at the age of 83.
Yeah, it's hard for me to dance on these people's graves. Even though he was ousted, Ben Ali died at the ripe old age of 83, receiving what I can only imagine is the best medical care in the world, surrounded by every manner of luxury and comfort, paid for by decades of looting the public good, the public treasury. And, there's no justice in his death. His death is just his death. It's just very, very underwhelming.
Ben Ali was indicted in Tunisia, but it doesn't matter. Saudi Arabia never handed him over, and he obviously lived, like Amr said, in luxury until he died. He stole all that money from Tunisia.
Yeah, and they never got it back. It's just, I don't mean to be very depressing or anything. It's just, I see all these posts, for example, online about people, they can't wait for Kissinger to die. And, neither can I. And all these people, these bad people, fuck off. But at the same time, it's even if Kissinger dies tomorrow, he'll die fucking 100 years old, having watched all of his political projects succeed spectacularly and receiving the best care in the world, getting the best comfort in the world, wealthy beyond measure. It's just depressing.
I was walking a couple years ago through Kensington in West London with a friend, and Kensington is a really wealthy area with, those beautiful row houses. And my friend was pointing out to me how so many of them stand empty because they're actually owned basically as investment properties and ways to hide money by dictators and their families. It's fucking bizarre.
Oh, absolutely. You look at a lot of real estate in Toronto as well, or in Vancouver and Montreal, and it's just ways for royal families in the Gulf to park money outside that they could use as an instant if anything goes sour in the region.
In the immediate period following Ben Ali's resignation, an interim government moved toward reform. Internet freedoms were restored, and formally banned parties like Ennahda were legalized. Sporadic protests continued as the interim government organized democratic elections and drafted a new constitution. In October 2011, Ennahda won the national elections and formed a coalition with two secular parties. In 2013, two prominent secular politicians, Chokri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi, were assassinated, and many Tunisians blamed Ennahda for the attack. Ennahda handed power to an interim government which organized new elections with the secularist Nada Tunis party winning. According to The Economist, hear us out, as of 2019, Tunisia is a flawed democracy, similar to the United States and South Korea. Unlike other post-uprising states, it hasn't seen a war, a military coup, or complete chaos. It's generally lauded as the most successful Arab revolt in terms of overthrowing a dictator and installing a democracy.
Yeah, arguably, I would argue it's the only success, limited as that success may be. And we'll get into the other countries of the Arab Spring going forward. But in terms of the series on our pod, I feel like we've started with the dessert before the main course. However,
Tunisia's success as a democracy doesn't mean that all problems have evaporated. The economy still lags, and public services are slow and inadequate. Tunisia certainly hasn't transformed into some sort of workers' utopia. In fact, lots of old liberal bourgeoisie remains in government. Terrorism threatens the country, and Tunisia's population has contributed a significant number of fighters to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. This all begs the question, which I think we'll have to reckon with throughout this podcast, as to whether a progressive authoritarian government is preferable to a reactionary democracy. Is progressive authoritarianism inherently an oxymoron? Is democracy always preferable, even if the majority would like to persecute some minority?
Yeah, there's a lot of tough questions this series, I think, will bring up, and we will discuss them, I think. One of the interesting things, I think, is you mentioned earlier in this episode how in 2002, Ben Ali played around with the laws to allow himself to govern past the 3-term limit that I imagine was constitutionally mandated. But one of the things I question is term limits are seen as a signifier of democracy in the sense that for most people, term limits are good. And you look at the way the media treat a country like, say, Bolivia, where Evo Morales used the Supreme Court to overturn certain term limits, and then, everything happened, and then the coup and all that. The idea being that if anyone tries to manipulate term limits, then they're by definition a dictator, and that's bad. But I also question, what if the people want someone to stay past their term limit? Surely it's the people's choice to decide if someone is doing a good enough job to continue doing that job. I think of someone like, say, Fidel Castro, who ruled Cuba for several decades without term limits of any kind. And, you could argue he was a dictator or not, but he's done spectacularly well for the Cuban people, given the restraints they've been under. Just the simple idea is, if the vast majority of people want someone to stay past a particular term limit, is it not more democratic to do that, or are term limits inherently liberatory?
Well, FDR stayed for 4 terms, 3.5 because he died. He only stopped being president because he died. And when you say that, most Americans will just shrug their shoulders and be like, yeah, it was World War II. He was really popular. He had the New Deal. People liked him. What's your point?
Yeah, also, I think the term limits in the US came after him, didn't they?
Formally, yes. Informally, no. He was definitely breaking the norm by doing that. But again, people were just like, all right.
Yeah, exactly. And, he's still regarded as one of the most popular presidents in history. So I'm not a big fan of the idea of term limits being seen as inherently good. I think it should be left to the people to decide whether someone should be left to stay or not.
I also think with COVID and with Donald Trump, a lot of Americans, certainly not the poorest Americans, the most vulnerable people, but sort of the middle class, are getting their first taste of true government incompetence. And they're not really protesting, nothing has really happened.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's incredible how much the American public in particular can accept as a new norm. I find it fascinating how completely apathetic and docile the American public is, even by Western standards. You look at a country like France, where there is a riot every week at least. And even, by the way, even Canada, with the sole notable exception of Quebec, is very docile. And, when I first came here to Toronto in 2012 for university, I remember seeing the news of students in Quebec protesting a rise in tuition fees. And by protest, they were rioting. And, I heard Canadians in Ontario, Anglophone Canadians, make fun of them, being like, oh, those Quebecois people, they riot over everything. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, yeah, exactly. The reason they pay much less tuition fees than the rest of the country is because they protest and they resist any attempt to privatize public services, to increase austerity, to increase tuition fees, and to decrease public spending. It works. The reason they do it is because it works.
Yeah, definitely. And protests in Tunisia had a huge effect on the Arab world, of course, in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Syria, Yemen, but also on the United States to a degree in Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, yeah. Occupy learned a lot from the Arab Spring, but also depressingly, Occupy just fizzled out.
Yeah, I don't know, fizzled out, yes, but also was repressed.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a combination of fizzling out repression as well as the misplaced hope that Barack Obama's second term will affect change. Not enough people were disillusioned enough with Barack Obama at that point to really push for radical uprising and, overthrow of a system.
Yeah, I hate to say it too, but Obama's messaging overall, especially in the beginning, was pretty good. Like healthcare for all, closing Guantanamo, ending the war on terror. Like a lot of people could get behind that, but he never did any of that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Obama, the candidate, was fantastic. Especially in 2008 when he was running against Hillary Clinton in the primaries, he really made a name for himself as quite the progressive, quite the person who was willing to answer to the American public and really push forward very popular programs while also going against, very unpopular things like the Iraq War. But then as soon as he stepped into office, he puts Rahm fucking Emanuel as chief of staff and just staffs his entire cabinet with Wall Street picks. And there goes that hope.
Yeah, definitely. So please tune in the following weeks as we move through the Arab Spring together and try to sort of answer those big questions that we've brought up.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I've been really looking forward to this and going to be very in-depth, and we hope you stick with us. Thanks for listening and thanks for supporting us.
If you like our content, you can find more at patreon.com/DosCriminal. You can subscribe to us on Instagram at DosCriminalPod, and please rate, follow, tell your friends. All of that stuff helps our podcast, and it's free. So we love you guys very much.
We really do. Thanks, everyone. Bye.